So nice to sit together with Sangha. So look around the room, see who's here tonight. Share some smiles. Hi to my online Sangha. And stretch, make yourself comfortable. Welcome to Insight Meditation Community of Charlotte. So we are in week 2 of a 4-part series on Sutta studies, where the leader gets to choose any sutta from 8,000 suttas and bring it. So it's always an interesting experience. And tonight I found a sutta that called to me because of the nuances in the story. To me, it read a little bit like a day in the life of the Buddha. And so that really appealed to me. And I'll see if you think that it has some of that flavor. It also has some other important qualities that that I'll tell you about at the end. So I'm calling this tonight's talk a conversation with the Buddha. It's morning in the great woods near the city of Vesali, and the Buddha has risen, dressed in yellow robes, and reaches for his alms bowl, readying himself to go out into the morning. The next task will be to walk into the city with his followers for donations of food for the day, their one meal. And unbeknownst to him, a visitor is on the way, walking through the woods. Ananda, one of his senior monks, is also out walking in the woods, and he sees this person approaching and hurries back to the camp to let the Buddha know. Ananda has recognized the person as Saccaka. He's a person from a respected clan, very skilled in rhetoric, and known to like argumentation and debate. He has a reputation for using clever but sometimes misleading arguments just in order to win or to appear wise. So everyone's aware that Saccaka is an outspoken critic of the Buddha. So Ananda tells the Buddha Saccaka is on the way to the camp and asks the Buddha to be compassionate and take time to talk with Saccaka. And I thought that was interesting because that means they're probably going to miss their one meal of the day. But he doesn't seem concerned about missing the gathering of food, more concerned that this person be given an opportunity to sit with his teacher, the Buddha. And often, according to the suttas, if the Buddha and the disciples are on the way with their alms bowls and someone stops them to ask a question or to request a teaching, the Buddha would say, please come back later. Because it was important for them to have their one meal of the day. Not only would he not eat, but nobody ate. So I think Ananda wanted to make sure that he did not do that. The Buddha agrees, and so the story begins to unfold. So this is my retelling of this conversation, and if you're curious about it, I can tell you where to find it so you can read it for yourself. In this conversation, we hear about what happens the night of the Buddha's awakening. He seems to have been in meditation around 10 plus hours because it refers to 3 different watches of the night, which are usually about 3 or so hours. So for those with copies of the Majjhima Nikāya, this is Sutta 36. Saccaka arrives, he's welcomed, pleasantries are exchanged, and he makes the formal request to ask to speak with the Buddha. And he's invited into the hall with the peaked roof where the Buddha has taken a seat and Sachaka sits to one side of him. So he begins by asking or telling the Buddha about the other spiritual teachers, the recluses and the Brahmins. He says they pursue development of the body, they practice extreme fasting, and all sorts of odd rituals to gain control over the body. And then other groups are pursuing development of the mind. Brahmanism was the popular religion of the day and strictly enforced a caste system, which the Buddha blatantly disregarded, welcoming any and all people, with the exception of women, unfortunately, which eventually did make their way in when his mother came and asked for the teachings. But that's a talk for another night. The disregard for the caste system added to the Buddha's reputation as a radical teacher, and it, for some, made him more unpopular. So Suchika wants to know what the Buddha thinks about these other teachers, the recluses, the Brahmins, and their practices. Perhaps he's baiting him to see if he will talk badly about the other teachers. And the Buddha simply turns to him and says, but what have you learned about development of the body? And what have you learned about development of the mind? And Suchika refers back to the other people. He says some Babas are walking around naked and you can't believe the ways in which they behave. But he's essentially unable to answer the question from his own experience. And that's what the Buddha's interested in. What is your experience? And so the Buddha says, so you don't know about the efficacy of developing the mind or the body, particularly in teachings by others, and you certainly don't know about the Buddha Dharma, because none of what you've said has anything to do with my teachings. The Buddha looks at him and says, listen closely to what I'm about to say. And Sachaka says, yes, sir. And the Buddha gives instructions to him about mindfulness of body, taming unwholesome thoughts, mindfulness of mind, working with pleasant and unpleasant feelings. He gives him a very long teaching. And Sachaka looks at him and says, I have confidence in Master Gautama. Gautama was the tribe that the Buddha was from. He says, Master Gautama is developed in body and mind. And the Buddha says something interesting here. Of course, we don't have the tone of voice, but we do have these words in the Sutta. He says, surely your words are offensive and discourteous, but I will continue to talk with you. So there must be something about this particular visitor that he senses this guy is just there to debate, basically. He's not really interested in the teachings. He just wants to engage and win. That's what I'm reading into it. So the Buddha says, your words are offensive and discourteous, but I will continue to speak with you. The Buddha now switches, and he's not calling him Sachaka, which is a friendlier name. He switches and starts calling him by his clan name. So that's an interesting thing. He's not so buddy-buddy, he's kind of being a little more formal. So after all this explanation about mindfulness of mind, the Sachaka asks if pleasant or unpleasant thoughts or feelings ever get lodged in the Buddha's mind. And the Buddha begins to give him similes of a person using a wet stick found floating in water to rub against a dry stick in order to start a fire. And he says, what would happen? And Suchika says, waste of time, disappointment. The Buddha compares the wet stick to Brahmins, recluses, anyone who is still saturated with the sense pleasures of the world in their body and their mind. And so he gives 4 different examples, and then he ends by saying, might it be better to use a dry stick found on land to rub with another dry stick in order to get the results of starting a fire? They both agree this produces the desired results. He explains that when one is removed from being saturated with the pleasures and distractions of the world, it's much easier to gain knowledge and insight into the true nature of life and not be hindered by distractions. Then this is interesting too. The Buddha is reported to have said, that just occurred to me spontaneously, those similes. And I think that's funny that he would say, oh, I just thought of that. So he goes on to say, in the previous years, he has crushed mind with mind. And I love that terminology. But then he says he's been overly ardent in his striving. He's fasted until all of his hair fell out and the knobs of his spine were able to be clearly seen. He also practiced extreme pranayama, breath control, breath practices, until he had splitting headaches and felt piercing pains through his body. Because he was able to master fasting and pranayama and other methods being taught by these teachers, he was asked by 2 of the leading spiritual teachers at the time to begin teaching, to be their master teacher. And he declined, stating that these practices did not deliver the kind of wisdom that he was seeking. Plus, he almost died from that. And so he was thinking, surely there's got to be a better way, right? So he tells Sachaka that it's not beneficial to deplete yourself in this way until you're exhausted, and that extreme practices don't steady the mind, but they dull the mind, and they don't bring calm abiding and the clarity that he can now remember from his earlier years of meditation when he was still living in his father's compound. He remembers sitting under a tree and practicing calm abiding, moving into a deep concentration, basically a jhana state, and he began to have wisdom breakthroughs with that practice. And so he decides, that's the way, I'm going back to that practice. So he tells the story of being in a deep concentrated state, and he begins to remember many past lives in great detail. He says he can remember his names, the names of the clans that he was part of. He can remember the food they ate and what they wore, even how and when he died, and he could see his subsequent rebirths, time after time after time. He says, and I'm quoting this from the book, thus with their aspects and particulars, I recollected my manifold past lives, and this was the first true knowledge attained by me in the first watch of the night. So he essentially has a vision of a chain of rebirths to start this evening of meditation. He goes on to talk of another breakthrough, a profound insight using this same method outlined in the 4 Foundations of Mindfulness. He says his mind was steady, malleable, bright, and in a state of imperturbability. And at this point, he could see clearly with his wisdom eye. He saw the passing away and the reappearance of all beings in accordance with their karma. If they had done good deeds, they attained good rebirth. If they had been evil and malicious, they did not attain good rebirth. Often being reborn as in the animal realm, or there's a hell realm in Buddhism as well. So he clearly grasped the law of karma, and this was the next true knowledge given that night. Direct knowledge of the law of cause and effect, or actions, karma. And then finally, he talks about this night of meditation and awakening, and he says to Sachaka, then I directly knew it as it actually is. And the word for this is vipassana, knowing as it is. Knowing as it actually is, or clear seeing. And so that is the name of the tradition that we practice in. The Vipassana, or the insight tradition, means to know things as they actually are. He then knew the repeating cycle of birth, sickness, old age, and death as dukkha, or suffering. He saw that the constant craving, clinging, and aversion was the origin of suffering. He saw that letting go, practicing wholesome and peaceful states, is cessation of suffering. And he saw the whole noble path of behavior, concentration, and wisdom was the way to the end of suffering. When he had this awakening experience, he reported he was liberated from craving at that point. He did not have the desire to strive, to become, or to be. And he was liberated from the taint of ignorance. He said, "I directly knew that birth is destroyed, the holy life had been lived, what had to be done had been done, and there is no more coming to any state of being." And still, his questioner persists, picking at him, asking mundane questions about, "But some people say you take naps in the afternoon, is that true?" And the Buddha must be just going, ay, 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 this guy. And he says, "Yes, I take naps in the afternoon. I mindfully recline. I'm fully aware of what I'm doing." And the guy says, but everyone says that's not a beneficial state, that you must, that's delusional. And so the Buddha very methodically and skillfully speaks to him, not in a harsh manner, but explains to him that basically what he's engaging in is unskillful and unmindful. And so finally Saccaka looks at him and says, "You know, when I talk to the other masters, they've lost their temper and they've spoken to me in a harsh manner." Again, trying to get the Buddha. He ends by saying, "Well, we're both busy and we have things to do. This has been delightful. I think I'll go now." The Buddha looks at him and says, "Do as you see fit. Now is the time." And Saccaka rises and leaves the camp. So this is so interesting because it's reported that this man is one of the folks that had direct access to the Buddha, sat face to face and got long involved teachings from him, and didn't seem to understand or resonate with the teachings, despite this direct access. Often you hear these stories and you hear the person wanted to join, wanted to learn more, or became enlightened immediately. The opposite was true with Saccaka. He just said thank you and got up and left. So why did I choose this particular sutta? It's new to me. I've never heard it taught here or anywhere. But more importantly, I think Saccaka represents the intellectual person who, despite being bright and having the rare opportunity to engage with the teachings, these beautiful, rare teachings from the Buddha, and this guy directly from the master, did not have the ears to hear, did not commit to a practice, wasn't really able to receive the teaching on a heart level, much less a head level, and so reportedly reaped no benefit from this interaction. This story highlights to me the importance of mindfulness in daily life, a humility of heart, like trying it on for yourself, and wise effort to stay in it, to keep coming back to it. This is not just an intellectual curiosity to be able to realize the fruits of this practice. Also, I thought it was cool that the name of the tradition that we practice in was spoken about by the Buddha on the eve of his awakening, the Vipassana, or insight. So I'll close us tonight with one of my favorite Dhamma quotes. "Whatever a person frequently thinks about and ponders, that will become the inclination of their mind." So I offer this for your consideration.